Hello, welcome to the University of Nottingham. Here in the University of Nottingham there's a group of historians who have formed a little group called the Heresy Network, and they're studying the impact of heresy as it's understood by historians. And one of those scholars is Dr. Claire Taylor. Claire, you're very welcome. Tell me about the Heresy Network, and then we might talk a little bit more in general about the importance of heresy for historians.
Okay, so the full name of the network is the Medieval Heresy and Dissent Network, Research Network, and we've used the terms heresy and dissent because there isn't a clear category of heresy. Historians don't really view it in that way. Very often what gets called heresy are just sort of dissident voices, people not necessarily explicitly challenging church doctrine, but being in a kind of grey area where they don't quite believe everything, or sometimes, in fact, being religious dissidents or political dissidents in some way. So we've got various things other than religion going on there, and it's become a very, very sort of in vogue subject these days. With the books of Dan Brown and Kate Moss, for example, that there's a huge public interest in heresy, and one of the things we've done with the network is to tap into this great interest that the public have, and we put on a public lecture, for example, last year where a couple of hundred people came. It was very successful, and we ran a masterclass as well before it with a leading heresy scholar called R.I. Moore, Bob Moore. He came and spoke to people and looked in great detail at sources. So it's a way in which historians can engage with the public in an area that the public are really interested.
The notion of heresy is fundamentally an ideological notion, whereas the notion of heretic is a person. And one of the interesting things from my background in working in theology departments is that it's incredibly easy for people to move from heresy to heretic. And of course the idea is a heresy is something very easy to define, because it's built on the idea that there is an orthodoxy, and then you note how it differs. But of course, when you actually start talking about a heretic, you're dealing with a human being, and it's an interesting question whether any two human beings ever think the same way. But when you actually start talking to a group of human beings, you realise that the way each human being receives any body of ideas, political, religious, social, even practical ideas, two craftsmen will each take a slightly different approach to something, is that there are no black and whites with human beings, because everyone has their own, they bring something of themselves, and they have their own unique perspective. In fact, even the medievals recognized this when they said whatever is received according to the way the receiver receives it. And it's an even worse tongue twister in Latin: quid recipitur secundum modum recipientus recipitur. But given that the way each human being responds to a body of ideas, you then are left with a situation that to describe someone as a heretic is fundamentally an excluding category, and it's to create a boundary, and it's almost to try and write an individual out rather than to deal with a set of ideas.
Absolutely. To call somebody a heretic is to sort of prescribe them in a particular way, to categorise them, but then to act as though that category of heretic is all that they are. So we can say that somebody is a heretic, and that would describe one aspect of who they were. But then once you add in power and authority into that equation, it means that they can that identification from the outside as heretic can then actually remove them from Christian society and place them outside of Christian society, even though for any individual it's just one aspect of who they are.
So it's interesting that in the movement, sometimes done by theologians, of confusing heresy and heretic, they don't realise how close they can come to identifying orthodoxy and totalitarianism.
I think that this is something that historians can offer, and it's an area in which theologians and historians work well together, because historians have got the access to that historical person's context, if you like, the society that they were part of, what was going on politically in that period. And so we can see the heretic as somebody shaped by their background, not just by their ideas. And I think this very much is resonating again with the public currently in terms of how people think about heresy, because we're finding people using the term heretic as a self-definition. Of course, in the Middle Ages, it was a terrible thing to be called a heretic. It put you into all kinds of danger. And to an extent in the modern period, there was a man recently hung in Iran, and the crime was heresy. He was executed for heresy. But in other cultures, it's taken as it's reclaimed, if you like. People are kind of calling themselves heretics. A really good example would be climate change deniers who they refer to themselves as heretics in that field. And I think what they're doing, they're not just talking about having oppositional ideas. They're talking about themselves as a marginalised, persecuted group within with the orthodoxy of climate change, if you like.
And of course, when you bring up the issue of the execution in Iran, we immediately put our hands up in horror, and I believe rightly so. But of course, there was a statute in the early 15th century, De Heretico Comburendo, regarding the burning of a heretic, which becomes part of English law, and which was widely used. So you can't actually have a discourse about heretics without having a parallel discourse, at least somewhere in the background, about the idea of human rights.
That's interesting, and again, that's something historians are very keen to historicise and to point out that what seems natural and normal and a kind of gut reaction for us as people in the 21st century studying historical subject matter is not as relevant or as useful than to actually exercise historical empathy, which doesn't mean that you sympathise with inquisitors or people who burned heretics, but it means you understand it from their perspective. You don't have to agree with it, and you can still hold your hands up in horror about it, but you have to understand what was their inner dialogue, why were they trying to do this? And ultimately, the Pope and leading clergy are responsible for people's souls after they die. So it's not just a case of wanting to persecute, although certainly inquisition and punishment and burning at the stake was a very good method of punishment, and it certainly worked as an aspect of social control. But social control by the clergy is not necessarily for their own benefit. It's supposed to be, as they understand it, for the health of Christianity.
But equally, once they hand over, to use the medieval phrase, they hand them over to the civil arm. When an English king puts De Heretico Comburendo on the statute book, he's doing it not so much as an act of piety for the good of Christendom, as it's far more akin to just getting rid of the opposition.
There's always a political context. It's very rare that you have a heresy trial or execution that is kind of in a bubble. It's always in the context of what's going on politically and what people want to be happening politically and socially.
Coming back to today, this idea that that people give themselves the title heretic. How do you think future historians, I know this is a hypothetical, but historians are able to get perspectives on the past because we're able to compare with the present. To use the self-definition of heretic, what does that say about our society in comparison with societies where heretic was something you sought to avoid at all costs?
This is a question that the Heresy Network actually is really engaging with at the moment, this idea of, yes, why is this happening now? And we're thinking about it in terms of the recent new kinds of social movements that have sprung up. So the anti-capitalist movements, for example, like Occupy, or the movements of the Arab Spring. These are movements which are trying to reorganise life in a politically different way. They're trying to overthrow authoritarian regimes, for example, or they're trying to undermine an ideology of capitalism. And so people are self-identifying as heretics by placing themselves in opposition to higher power, to authoritarian regimes or perceived authoritarian regimes. And we think that this is why there is this resonance. People are seeing themselves not just as the underdog, but as somebody persecuted and marginalised, and people wanting to kind of reclaim their voice.
Claire, thank you very much for not only introducing us to the concept of heresy as a medieval phenomenon, but also to the concept of heretic as a contemporary one. Thank you.